So this panel will have three presentations from Hana Samaržija from the University of Zagreb, Elvio Baccarini from the University of Rijeka, and Aleksandra Knežević from the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. And since the three papers are somewhat connected, I suggest that each of you presents for about 25 minutes, and then we can have open the floor for discussion. So yeah, first is Hana Samaržija on applied and engaged epistemology, lessons from the epistemology of democracy. So Hana, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm just going to try to explore whether we have reached a point in theory when we can talk about an engaged epistemology. So first, we will discuss standard analytical epistemology, or SAE, and to see why it's neither applied nor engaged. Then we will talk about epistemology's three applied expansions. First is epistemology as psychology, or naturalized epistemology. Then we will be talking about virtue-based social epistemology, then virtue-based political epistemology, and finally about the epistemology of democracy as an engaged epistemology. So in its basic form, standard analytical epistemology, or SAE, was focused on the individual epistemic agent and his imagined cognitive processes. Here it used the method of rational reconstruction to kind of retroactively conceive what the agent did or experienced while assessing evidence. And SAE's imagined epistemic agent existed in a social vacuum, completely devoid of other people, and his evidential base was largely limited to trivial sensory inputs. Even so, SAE laudably launched this focus on truth as the ultimate epistemic goal, or as the focus of epistemic quality. Clearly, with its links to abstract logic and the philosophy of mind, SAE valued clarity and rigor above excitement, to quote Hare, who was quoted by Wolff in his paper, which motivated this conference. And with less charity, it could also be stated that SAE had little concern with actual empirical epistemic agents who exist in epistemic communities, share evidence with others through the testimony and teaching. And this focus on reconstructing an agent's cognitive processes rather than engaging with actual psychology launched SAE's first implied expansion, and this was, of course, Quine's naturalized epistemology. So from the 60s onwards, standard analytical epistemology underwent 3 applied and 1 engaged expansion, each of which is worth addressing on its own. In 1969, Quine's seminal article, Epistemology Naturalized, proposed to replace the method of rational reconstruction with actual psychology, which could tell us more about how agents really and genuinely process and internalize external inputs. In this way, abstract standard analytical epistemology could be applied to empirical epistemic agents who undergo empirical psychological processes. However, this is not the kind of applied epistemology that could lead to concrete policies about how people should behave. Due to people's cognitive limitations, policies that arose from naturalized epistemology would most likely be paternalistic, which would bring along its own set of questions and issues about the values of freedom and personal choice. Moreover, Quine's natural epistemology suffers from another problem Wolff should have predicted: redundancy, which he actually spoke about when he mentioned that perhaps philosophy sometimes seems redundant because it could be replaced by any kind of civic engagement. And namely, it is unclear why someone would choose to engage with naturalized epistemology instead of simply engaging with psychology. Similarly, other applied and engaged philosophical branches would likely just melt into related humanities and social sciences, such as sociology, political science, pedagogy, and like. Back in 1991, Alvin Goldman published the introductory volume Liaisons, which argued that epistemology should join forces with the cognitive sciences and sociology to grasp how agents genuinely behave. With his groundbreaking work, Knowledge in a Social World, Goldman placed the epistemic agent, who had hitherto existed in a vacuum, in a social world of testimony, trust, political institutions, and social networking. However, social epistemology entailed the issue of the implausibility of recommendations. Although Goldman's agent was now socialized, they were still an idealized versions of how humans genuinely behave when giving or receiving testimony or making judgments about politics. To ameliorate this issue, social epistemology often joined forces with virtue epistemology to propose a virtuous behavior for agents to espouse. This, however, did not eliminate the issue of implausibility, as perfectly virtuous behavior was still implausible. Several years ago, social epistemology, sorry, my phone just a second. Okay. Several years ago, social epistemology branched into the even more specific field of political epistemology, which deals with the epistemic features of political institutions. So far, political epistemology has proven to be applied or even somewhat engaged by discussing deliberative and participative democracy, epistocracy, extremism, political polarization, and voter ignorance. However, political epistemology inherited social epistemology's dogmatism and implausibility of recommendations. Its solutions to social problems still largely depended on agential virtue and self-improvement. For instance, if voters are ignorant of politically relevant facts and institutions, the solution is to instill in them the virtues of epistemic responsibility and epistemic humility. Also, although this is a decent philosophical conclusion when we're talking about abstract or idealized epistemic agents, it's an utterly useless basis for social policy. One of Goldman's followers, who Wolf has mentioned, Miranda Fricker, launched an entirely new area of investigation on the brink between social and political epistemology with her 2007 book, Epistemic Injustice: Power and the Ethics of Knowing. In the work, Fricker claimed that we continuously deprive marginalized groups such as women, people of color, and working class agents of the epistemic credibility they have warranted. However, to fix this social issue, Fricker simply pled for agents to develop the virtue of epistemic justice, which would have them treat all others with the due respect. Nonetheless, it remains clear that as a policy proposal, this is still wildly implausible, as we cannot force nor compel agents to develop an entirely abstract epistemic virtue. Fricker first noted that the problem should be fixed by policy in 2016 in Routledge's Handbook on Epistemic Injustice, and the first application of epistemic injustice that attempted to resolve it by changing the surrounding epistemic institutions arrived as late as 2021, with mine and Ivan Cerovat's work on the institutional preconditions of epistemic injustice published in Social Epistemology. Still, the issue of epistemic injustice reveals why much of applied social and political epistemology is wildly implausible as a concrete policy. It relies heavily on abstract epistemic virtues or hopes for agent improvement that have no basis in empirical psychology. Similarly, works in testimonial epistemology and agent disagreement focus heavily on agential virtues, as do studies in collective epistemology and the entire field of policy in appropriate virtue epistemology. In 2016, with the ostensibly deleterious outcome of the Brexit referendum and Donald Trump's notorious presidential victory in the United States, theorists became interested in why democracy, which is supposed to be the best and the justest political order, produces such substandard results. Works in the epistemology of democracy thus range from appeals to move beyond it altogether and embrace some form of expert rule, such as Brennan's forthcoming work in 2022, and pleas to fix democracy by adding more democracy, such as Helen Landamore's 2020 Open Democracy. However, not all work in the epistemology of democracy, which was genuinely inspired by democracy's empirical failures, meets Wolff's steps for an engaged philosophy. For example, Landemore does not meet his third criterion of examining past solutions nor policies that have been tried and failed when suggesting we correct democracy by making it more democratic. Similarly, Sunstein fails his second notion by not exploring the empirical methodology of political polarization when suggesting how to ameliorate such cases. If we were rigid in following Wolff's steps, an engaged epistemology of democracy would have to first determine democracy's current empirical failures, then identify the conflict between political and epistemic values, then examine the historical changes to presidential representative democracies, profile possible solutions, and finally evaluate the remaining options. Similar methodologies can be found in the recent writings on political epistemology, such as Michael Hannon's Routledge Handbook of Political Epistemology and Rector Snežana Samaržij's acclaimed Democracy and Truth. Following Wolff's steps, we could conclude that democracy malfunctions due to nepotism and voter ignorance, that failing to meet epistemic aims has proven to be deleterious, that epistocracy has often been proposed but never attempted, and that we could strive for a division of epistemic labor between citizens and experts, and then evaluate the potential quick conflicts between democracy and expert rule. Nonetheless, an epistemology that follows or broadly reflects Wolff's steps does not seem like an unpracticable or distant proposal. In either case, both applied and engaged epistemology seem like a step forward from standard analytical epistemology that had very little to do with the real world of empirical epistemic agents acquiring and exchanging knowledge in a troubled social world. However, it might benefit applied epistemology, such as social epistemology and works on epistemic injustice, to focus less on agential virtue and more on the surrounding social institutions. In other words, applied epistemology would benefit from Wolff's engaged epistemology's rigorous methods. Thank you for your attention. I will now stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Hana, for that interesting presentation. So now I invite Elvio.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Okay, so now we'll hear from Elvio Baccarini from the University of Rijeka on the role of science and values in public deliberations. I don't know, Elvio, if you have a PowerPoint or not.
Yes, I do. So please, if you, okay, if you permit me to.
Okay, let me just. So you don't have the share screen option?
Share screen, yes.
Okay.
Okay, so do you see now my PPT?
No.
No?
We still don't see it.
Now
you started sharing.
Now it's sharing.
Good.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much for the opportunity to participate at today's conference. It's really a great pleasure. Hope soon we'll have possibility to meet in person as well. So I discuss the functioning of a well-ordered democracy that, in my view, must be respectful of several evaluative standards. So some of them are moral and political, like the idea of society as a fair system of cooperation among free and equal citizens. But a further relevant evaluative standard is represented by the quality of decisions that includes epistemic merits. It implies the value of responsibility in public decision-making. So we need to be responsible in public decision-making and care that decisions do not harm people's rights. The two sets of values can come into conflict. One of the reasons is that the demand for quality of decisions can clash with the demand of equality of citizens, namely ruling society by respecting the equality of citizens in the form of procedural equality in public decision-making can result in the rule of ignorance. Various demands, thus, must be properly balanced in order to shape a form of democracy that respects equality of citizens and epistemic responsibility as well. We can find an appropriate framework in John Rawls' work, and I refer to his later book, Political Liberalism. In particular, I refer to his theory of legitimacy and his conception of justification of public decisions represented by the theory of public reason. According to this view, at least some specific public decisions are legitimate only if they are justified for valid public reasons. In order to shape the equilibrium between the two demands shown above, I highlight the epistemic elements in Rawls' doctrine of public justification, and I propose an amendment to his formulation. The discussion focuses on science as public reason and to the proper way to implement this idea that needs to be more complex than it is present in Rawls' original formulation. Science as public reason, however, does not imply the authority of scientists to rule when scientific reasons contribute to shape justified public policies. First, in many situations, science leads us to conditions of reasonable pluralism. In such conditions, a qualified democratic proceduralism represents the proper solution. Second, scientific reasons must be balanced with moral and political reasons. And I confirm this idea through a historical illustration. This leads to even further pluralism and to further democratization of the public decision-making process. A well-functioning democracy, however, is not unqualified. It is qualified by the employment of valid justificatory reasons. Such are reasons that are not submitted to moral, political, and epistemic flaws. The democratic process is thus constrained by the employment of valid reasons. However, it resists the challenge of trying to shape public decisions by the mere application of a general worldview or doctrine or theory. The democratic process needs to be inclusive of all variations of reasonable pluralism. In the paper, I proceed like follows. First, I highlight the epistemological side of Rawls' conception of public justification, and I indicate the problem of disagreement related to Rawls' employment of scientific reasons as valid public reasons in public justification. Second, I propose an amendment of Rawls' description of scientific public reasons that is more sensitive to real-world needs by attributing legitimacy to a set of eligible conclusions of science instead only to uncontroversial conclusions. Third, I suggest fair procedure of choice in such sets as what establishes scientific public reasons in a context. Fourth, I indicate a historical example to show that further pluralism is obtained because public decisions cannot be an exclusive matter of scientific reasons, even when such reasons contribute to shape decisions. Moral and political values matter as well. Fifth, I describe how this further pluralism contributes to a further democratization of the public decision-making process, represented by a qualified democracy based on the choice among eligible sets of potential decisions based on valid public, moral, and political reasons. So, among valid public reasons admitted by roles in public justification, there are, quote, the methods and conclusions of science when these are not controversial. This is an important identification of public reasons, but in my view, such definition of the epistemic condition of valid public reasons needs to be amended. Like we see in practice, we need frequently to make public decisions by relying on science, while there are still disagreements in the scientific community, and the pandemic is full of such illustrations. We do not have, all the times that we need it, actual consensus in science and an unequivocal determination of the best supported beliefs. The problem that appears here is how to manage a condition when we cannot postpone a decision and there is disagreement among experts, either because questions are not resolved in a field of expertise or because different fields of expertise recommend different decisions. So, Rawls' determination of scientific public reasons is too narrow. A proper determination needs to find a way to engage a set of reasons between two extremes. The two extremes are, on one side, uncontroversial scientific reasons, and pseudoscience, fake news, and in general, clearly flawed beliefs on the other side. In between, there are beliefs that can be helpful and better than alternative beliefs. In order to employ them, we need a more inclusive definition of public reasons for the employment of scientific resources in public justification than the one offered by Rawls. So I propose to include as valid public reasons conclusions of science that are controversial among scientists, that is, competing conclusions of different scientists, provided they are sufficiently plausible as competitors in scientific disputes. In such cases, all conclusions are results of the virtues of scientific methodology, looking for evidence, responding to evidence, coherence, valid reasoning, and so on. These conclusions are sustained by reasons and methods that scientists commonly endorse. However, they remain empirically undetermined, as evidence is insufficient to have uniquely justified conclusions. Conclusions require the employment, for example, of judgment of scientists, but their judgments can reasonably vary. For example, the attribution of probabilities can legitimately vary, or different explanations of facts could be legitimate. In my view, in such cases, valid public reasons are represented by eligible sets of conclusions of science. There are not uniquely justified conclusions of science, but there are a few alternative reasonable conclusions scientifically legitimate. All of them can function as valid public reasons. It is legitimate to make public decisions by choosing justificatory reasons for public decisions among conclusions in such eligible sets. The motivations for endorsing such reasons as valid public reasons are, first, sometimes we need to make urgent decisions even when we do not have at our disposal conclusions of science that are not controversial among scientists. Second, conclusions of science that are controversial among scientists are still grounded on shared reasons represented by commonly accepted methods and evidence. Third, such conclusions are reasonable and better than alternative reasons. This is because of the comparative merits of methodology of science. So, the comparative merits shown in this picture. I remark the importance of two for the aims of public reason. That is, conclusions of science that are controversial among scientists are still grounded on shared reasons represented by commonly accepted methods and evidence. Namely, for Rawlsian public reason, it is essential that all decisions are justified for reasons that all reasonable persons can share. However, this could appear as a problem for the employment of scientific reasons that I have proposed in the present paper. One could say that if justification is based on sets of eligible justificatory reasons, then in fact, justification is not based on shared reasons, but rather on alternative reasons that are endorsed by scientists in competition. Still, there is a response to such an objection. Namely, all eligible proposals are justified for reasons shared by all scientists. These are the components that distinguish science as a specific practice, such as, for example, evidence, proofs, and methodological components of science. Conclusions that are controversial among scientists thus are legitimate reasons in public justification because their basic justification consists in shared reasons. This conception of legitimacy, however, raises the need for some elaboration, because by allowing sets of conclusions that are controversial among scientists, we do not arrive to a single legitimate decision, but to a set of eligible legitimate decisions. This could appear as a situation of impasse. However, the resources that we have are still important, and the condition of impasse is not desperate. We have a set of valid public reasons that are recognized as such among scientists. This set of valid public reasons permits us, first, to exclude the reasons opposed to science as unreasonable and not admitted in public justification, and second, to have a set of eligible reasons, that is, reasons that we can reasonably choose and employ in public justification. We do better not to treat them as if not having any comparative merit over conclusions justified through pseudoscience and fake news. After all, they are the best that we have. The employment of such reasons protects reasonableness. Namely, contrary to unreasonable conclusions, those sustained through fake news or pseudoscience, all eligible decisions are reasonable because they are supported by valid public reasons. Still, we do not have unique scientific reasons, and there is the problem of deciding which we need to employ as reasons that justify public decisions. In my view, the proper resolution in such cases is represented by a fair democratic procedure of choice among eligible scientific reasons that will be employed like justificatory reasons in a context. This introduces a qualified democratic element in science as public reason. Democracy as a value thus appears even in conditions that require a high level of specialized expertise. Democratization goes further because public decisions cannot be a matter of scientific reasons only. Political and moral reasons matter as well. For example, a historical illustration shows clearly that relying only on scientific reasons threatens justice, or could threaten justice. The historical illustration that I present is represented by the Contagious Diseases Act that was passed and further refined in Great Britain in the 19th century. The act was sustained by scientific elite of the time, and its declared intention was to contain sexually transmitted diseases. But it was strongly opposed by John Stuart Mill. The opposition was based on Mill's claim of unfairness of the act. Without entering into details that cause interpretative disputes among scholars, the unfairness was based on exclusive burdens put on women that were or were suspected of being prostitutes, while men had only benefits. The relevant aspect is that Mill opposed the act in virtue of its unfairness. We see thus that moral and political reasons contribute to constraining the employment of scientific reasons. Such considerations matter first when different policies could be efficacious for a valuable end, as the end of containing the spread of contagious diseases. We need to choose the policy that better corresponds to values and justice. Such was not the Contagious Diseases Act that was unfair because it put all burdens on women. A problem appears, however, in the case that we do not have equally efficacious public health policies. The problem is present when the most efficacious policy is not the best in terms of fairness, or it is even distinct by unfairness. So I think that lockdown could provide such examples where some parts of the population, in fact, has visibly stronger burdens than other parts of the population. And obviously, the premise of this thesis is that lockdown, in effect, is an effective measure of containing the spread of pandemic. In such cases, we have conflicts between valid public reasons. For example, do we have to favor public health or fairness? In such cases, the value of a qualified democracy is crucial. Namely, democratic decision-making is the proper model of choice among alternative proposals that are eligible because they are all sustained through valid public reasons. In the present case, such are valid moral and political reasons. But in the present model of public justification, the scientific reasons that confirm that a policy is the most efficacious in terms of public health cannot be dismissed in virtue of moral and political reasons that are not valid public reasons. Such were, for example, present in moralized oppositions to the Contagious Diseases Act. This camp saw the policies inspired by the intention to render sexual intercourse with prostitution safe as a way of favoring such practices. The proper reaction toward contagious diseases in sexual intercourse, was the idea, is not to render such intercourse safe, but sexual moderation or even chastity. Here we have an appeal to moral reasons that are not valid public reasons. They cannot sustain proposals antagonistic to the most efficacious public health policies. In conclusion, I propose methods and conclusions of science when these are not controversial, and proposals that are in the set of eligible conclusions of science as my amendment of Rawls' narrower definition of methods and conclusions of science when these are not controversial as public reasons. Clearly, we would prefer to have a set of uniquely valid reasons and not alternative eligible reasons, among else, in order to favor the possibility to arrive at the end to uniquely justify decisions. Nonetheless, even such eligible reasons are a valuable resource, respectful of reasonableness. The pluralism that is present retrieves the value of democracy as the resource for the proper resolution of the argumentative impasse. Democracy is further a value that we cannot avoid in public decision-making because of further reasonable disagreement due to the plurality of valid moral and political reasons that can be employed in public justification. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Elvio, for that presentation that is quite on topic for where we are here and now. So now we'll hear from Aleksandra Knežević. She will discuss the deliberative division of labor and policy making. Aleksandra, if you have a PowerPoint.
Yes, I have, and I will share my screen now.
Yes, yes.
Just to see how to do that.
You should have
Yes.
a button that says.
Okay.
Great.
So hello, everyone. Today I will, do you see my screen?
Yeah. Yes, it's good.
Everything is normal because...
Yeah, we can see it. Only maybe if you could put it like in full screen. Great, that's great.
Just a second, please, I have to, okay, like this. Today I will present my research in progress, and I hope to hear your feedback on it, since it's really at the beginning. So the title of my research is The Deliberative Division of Labor in Policymaking. And the main research question which I would like to answer is how to structure policymaking informed by science. And here at this table, I would like to provide some context of my claims, context in which I make my claims, which is mainly inspired by the discussion in philosophy of science. So here I will start with the fact-value dichotomy. So the fact-value dichotomy is a claim. It's in fact the value neutrality claim that states that in scientific research, facts and values can keep separate. So in scientific research, scientists deal with facts and not with values. So in that sense, science is value neutral. However, this distinction in philosophy of science is undermined by the existence of thick concepts. And thick concepts are those concepts in which the descriptive and normative component are entangled together. So this is the example, for example, the concept of poverty is the example of thick concepts. So social scientists use these concepts in order to describe what's happening in the world. However, we all believe that poverty is bad. So you hear how these two descriptive and normative components are entangled together. So even though the thick concepts undermine the fact-value dichotomy, still we have philosophers who claim that even though science is not value neutral, we should have the ideal of value-free science, which means, and Max Weber is, for example, the most prominent advocate of this ideal. He says that even though science is not value neutral, we should try as much as possible to keep facts and values separate in any chosen area of research. So we should have this as an ideal, and Weber argues that this is the case because objectivity requires value freedom. However, this claim is also widely disputed today, and as I understand, there is an increasing number of philosophers who argue against the value-free ideal of science. Philip Kitcher, for example, Helen Longino, and other feminist philosophers, and they say that science needs values because values are epistemically beneficial, which means that values help us to gain new knowledge and even to reach objectivity, for example, in the case of Helen Longino, who claims that. So I would also here like to mention the argument from inductive risk, which I believe is one of the most forceful arguments which was put forward for the tapestry model of science. So yes, and the tapestry model of science is the model in which facts and values are deeply entangled. So the argument from the inductive risk by Heather Douglas goes like this. So since science is essentially uncertain, because as we know from Popper and Hempel, scientific claims can never be confirmed with the absolute certainty, only to a certain degree. So since this is the case, when scientists decide whether to reject or accept a hypothesis, scientists must take into considerations the consequences of a possible error. So I will give you the example. So a patient arrives at a hospital and he is in pain, and doctors think that he might be experiencing a heart attack. However, they do not have enough evidence to state that with high certainty. Therefore, in the light of the available evidence, they dismiss heart attack as the possible problem. However, they were wrong, and the consequences of their false claims are severe. So Douglas, in that sense, Douglas claims that depending on our values, our social, political, ethical values, we will calculate differently the consequences of possible errors. And as a consequence to that, we will require more or less evidence before we state a claim. And she says that this is especially the case for science, which informs policymaking. So we see here what is the idea, that in order to reach a decision, decision in science to accept or reject a scientific hypothesis, we need values in order to calculate, do we have enough evidence to reach a conclusion? So, and this is the tapestry model of science, which undermines the value-free ideal of science. And so in this model, values are the essential part of scientific research. And I would also like to point out here to Kevin Elliott's book, The Tapestry of Science, in which he explains how values interfere with different levels of scientific practice. So the choice of research methodology, the choice of research questions, assumptions, background assumptions, and so on. All of these core processes of science are affected by values, according to Kevin Elliott or Heather Douglas. So my first claim, which I would like to raise here, is that these two views about science imply different roles of scientists in policymaking. Therefore, they imply different models of policymaking informed by science. So I will here start with the value-free ideal of science. I argue that the value-free ideal of science implies the division of labor model in policymaking. And I will here again refer to Max Weber. This time his paper, his lecture, in fact, Science as a Vocation, in which he argues that science cannot tell us how we should lead our life and which goals we should strive to, for example. But he says that science can provide us with means with which we can accomplish the goals we have chosen. In other words, science provides us with means to accomplish our ends. And I believe from these Weber's claims, we can infer that for Weber in policymaking, scientists should be the ones who provide us with facts and only with facts, especially having in mind the fact-value dichotomy. So in order to support my claim, I would like to discuss Tim Lowen's argument. So Tim Lowen's argues that, and I will just have to check. So Tim Lowen's argues that especially in the cases in which we have to evaluate new technologies, the labor is divided between those who discuss purely scientific questions and between those who address more broader social, political, and legal dimensions. And in order to support his claims, he also discusses that he does a case study of the mitochondrial donation. And this is a technology in which 3 different individuals are allowed to donate their genetic material to the embryo. So we see here how many ethical considerations could arisen from this technology. And he discusses this case and he concludes that if in those cases when we have to evaluate new technologies, the labor is divided between those who discuss purely scientific issues and those who discuss normative issues, then intermediary and, as he says, crucial and essential questions, which are also the hybrid questions in which the technical ethical boundary is undermined, those questions will be left unanswered. And he gives an example, again referring to Heather Douglas, that the example of such a question is whether sufficient evidence has been collected to proceed in some novel technological direction. So this is Lowen's claim. So even though he does not address Weber directly, he argues against the division of labor model in policymaking. And I would also here like to address Eyal's claims. So found this book, The Crisis of Expertise. Eyal directly challenges Weber, and he says that it's not the case that scientists should provide us only with facts, because there are certain trans-scientific questions which arise in the course of the interaction between science or technology and society, and they're epistemologically speaking questions of facts and can be stated in the language of science. And they should and will be asked of scientists. So those are the matters in which scientists have a responsibility to intervene. Yet they are unanswerable by science, they transcend science. And Eyal says that these trans-scientific questions require expertise. So he defines experts as people, scientists who were able to answer trans-scientific questions. But just for the simplicity's sake, I will continue to use the term scientists. So we here have 2 arguments against the division of labor model, which invoke the concepts of intermediary and trans-scientific questions. And I would also like to add another argument against the division of labor model, which is proposed by Heather Douglas again. And she argues against the reporting facts only view of scientists' role in policymaking. She says that scientists rarely report only raw facts to policymakers. They are usually called upon to interpret facts because policymakers rarely have the requisite expertise to do so, to interpret facts. Thus, it's fitting that scientists are called upon to make some sense of raw facts. And she also says that they have responsibility to do so. Yet, the selection of interpretations by scientists involves the value-laden selection of background assumptions. And again, this is something that is assumed in the tapestry model of science. Yes. So if we have now a Heather-Douglas argument, and we have then the new division of labor, the new model in policymaking, which I call the new division of labor, the no division of labor model in policymaking. The question is, what role do scientists play in this new model? So I will, I will here, I would like to introduce here Thomas Christiano's paper. So this is more a political philosophy paper than philosophy of science. And similarly, yet differently to Weber, I believe, he claims that scientists have a dual role in policymaking, to decide among themselves what are the best theories for crafting legislation. And second, to provide means for reaching ends. So this is the same formulation as we have in Weber. However, these ends, so these means are prescribed by citizens' basic aims. So what are the basic aims? Those are the needs, interests, priorities determined by what citizens value. So having all this in mind, I would like to argue that in this model, in the no division of labor model, scientists provide advice rather than raw facts. And advice requires an interpretation of facts, and such an interpretation is done in accordance with citizens' basic aims. So this is, I hope this is my core claim. So, how would I like to support my claim? So my idea is to provide a case study of the Serbian COVID-19 crisis staff. And the main aim of this case study would be first to support my claim that the no division of labor model, that in the no division of labor model, scientists provide advice rather than raw facts only. And the second, my second aim would be to show the weaknesses of the no division of labor model. So in order to do that, first, I believe that I will have to show that the crisis staff was structured as a no division of labor model. That is, to show that the role of scientists went beyond reporting facts only. And I think this won't be a difficult thing to do, especially because Predrag Kon, who is the most prominent member of the Serbian COVID-19 crisis staff, said himself that the crisis staff is an advisory body, so that they provide advice how to craft a legislation. But nevertheless, I would like to do a really in-depth analysis of how they structure their advice and what are their assumptions about their role in policymaking and so on. So I believe this won't be a difficult thing to do, I hope. However, the second thing which I will have to show is that the reason why the crisis staff failed to provide good advice, and I will also explain why I think they failed to do so, was due to the particular division of labor and its weaknesses rather than politics involved. So I'm not completely sure will I be able to show this because politics was very much involved. I have my reasons to believe that their advice, especially in a particular time period, which was last year when Serbia was in a curfew, in lockdown, I believe then that their advice was not so much influenced by politics, even though all the decisions, of course, were political. So yes, this is going to be a harder part to explain. So having all this in mind, I will argue that the case of the Serbian COVID-19 crisis staff shows that the weakness of the non-division of labor model is that it does not enable scientists to become familiar with citizens' basic aims. And finally, why is it important that scientists become familiar with citizens' basic aims? So, and this is all included already in Cristiano. So the first thing is because their advice includes an interpretation of facts that is grounded on what citizens value. If otherwise, if citizens' advice is grounded on, in the best case, what they think citizens value, then citizens would not be in the driver's seat in the society. So these are the claims which are already present in Cristiano, and I hope that my research will provide a support to Cristiano's claims, and my research which would be conceptualized as a research in philosophy of science. So then the crucial question is, whose values should scientists represent? And I believe that in philosophy of science, this question is not sufficiently addressed. And the answer is then obviously that citizens' values, and how should scientists get to know what citizens value? So it's by deliberating with citizens. Thus, policymaking should enable deliberation between citizens and scientists. And how should such a policymaking be structured? It should be structured as a deliberative division of labor, which can take form in different settings available so far, many public citizen juries, and so on. So this is still a very underdeveloped part of my research, and especially if we take into consideration that I still have to do the case study. But so far, this is what I have, and I'm looking forward to all your questions and also suggestions, and maybe if you have any advice how to proceed, or do I need substantial change. That would be all. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Aleksandra. And thank all three of you for sharing your ideas on in different ways about how do we make policy decisions, and who are experts, what is the role, and what should be the role of experts in this political decision making. So now I'll open the floor for questions and comments that you have either for Hana, Elvio, or Aleksandra. And of course, if you have a comment or a question that touches upon something that all three of them talked about, all three are welcome to respond. So Joe, you were the fastest one to raise your hand, so please go ahead.
Sorry, I've already spoken too much, so I will be as quick as I can, but I have one very short question for each speaker. So, so for Hana, really interesting presentation, and great to see the application of my ideas, but I'm slightly worried that what is happening is I've replaced one form of dogmatism with another form of dogmatism, and that now people have to follow my formula or they're doing something wrong. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about whether it is a genuine criticism of someone that they haven't followed the steps that I've given, or whether they're just doing something else, or where they, to put it crudely, what is the cash value of failing to follow these steps? So what harm does it do? For Elvio, the obvious question, I mean, fantastically relevant paper about what's going on, as Marko said. And of course, we're all thinking about climate change and COVID vaccine science denial. And so there, the obvious question is, what are the limits to legitimate scientific disagreement? And what counts as crank science that's outside the standard discourse? And then to Aleksandra, very interesting proposal. I wonder whether you will find citizens speaking with one voice or many voices, and whether you have a way of dealing with that disagreement. Okay, over.
Okay, I will start. Thank you, Joe, for your comments. So I actually genuinely do think that these are substantial criticisms, but not because necessarily they're your steps and we need to dogmatically follow your steps, but because, for example, failing to assess the empirical evidence from the past is a failure in itself. Because if you're trying to make evidence-based suggestions about, for example, democracy, because, for example, I criticize Helen Landemore for not assessing previous failures of democracy, and I do think this is a substantial criticism, not because this is your third proposal, but because failing to assess empirical evidence is a failure in itself. So I just think that in your paper, you were very prescient in kind of listing the failures that genuinely make philosophical work weaker, and that make it less convincing, and that make it less compelling, if that answers your question.
Elvio?
Okay, thank you very much, Joe. That's really very helpful. So I would answer by distinguishing about different possible conditions in science, where on one side we have the state of the art. And when we have the state of the art, clearly there is no problem in general. This is or is very close to the Rawlsian definition of scientific valid public reasons. At the other extreme, there are dissenting positions that are dissenting in the sense that in general they are refused by the scientific community, and they are refused mainly because of flaws from the standpoint of the value of science. So not relying sufficiently on evidence, and flaws of that are flaws from the standpoint of the core resources of science. And the third, there are disagreements where science is still a work in progress, like happened frequently or still happening in this pandemic era. So I would say that legitimate, in the first case, I mean, when we have a clear state of the art, there's no disagreement and no problem. Looking at the cases of disagreement, I would say that the limits are represented by conditions where science is still a work in progress. We have some good evidence that is in any event the best evidence that we have when we have to make public decisions, but there is still a space for reasonable disagreement between the reasonable judgments because between scientists. So outside these limits are situations where some scientists are charged because of flaws and insufficient respect of the virtues of the scientific method.
Okay, Aleksandra?
Thank you very much for your question. So one voice or many citizens' voices. So I think one of the necessary conditions for deliberation is that all citizens' views, all their opinions have their representative in deliberative arena. So, and then the next question would be, well, we are discussing value issues. So the value disagreements can be too broad between different parts of a society or one society. And I believe this can be understood as an empirical question. And in fact, it has been measured how do citizens change their opinions before and after a deliberation. So, and I'm a bit cherry picking the evidence, but I was reading a paper in which they explained that after deliberation, people had the same value assumptions. However, their opinions regarding how to solve a particular issues converge to one another. So I hope that in those cases when, for example, we are discussing vaccines, even though different value standpoints will provide different answers how to craft legislation, nevertheless, the deliberation would also be beneficial in a sense that people will be able to reach a consensus regardless of their different value standpoints. So yes, of course, all citizens' views have to be represented as the condition for deliberation and democracy as such.
Okay, now we have Ivan Cerovac. Ivane, please.
Thank you. So thank you for great talks. I have many questions, but I'll limit myself to only two, one for Professor Baccarini and one for Aleksandra Knežević. So the first one, is about your proposal maybe not being epistemic enough. And now let me try to explain. So if I followed your idea correctly, the idea is that we have two stages in this decision-making process. In the first stage, scientists give eligible reasons, or eligible sets of reasons that can be used in public decision-making. And here we have to take into account that not all these reasons are equally supported by evidence. Nonetheless, they are all about certain threshold. They can all be still regarded as sufficiently justified or sufficiently good reasons to be able to admit it as public reasons in a public debate. And then that's the first stage. And the second stage is where citizens or their representatives select, using democratic procedures, what they want or what they think are the best reasons from among those reasons offered by scientists. And it seems to me that this has a great epistemic advantage of filtering terrible or bad or non-scientific reasons. It filters them out. Nonetheless, it might be not epistemic enough, because it seems to me that among those reasons that are above the threshold, not all reasons are equally good. Some are supported by the majority, some are supported by stronger reasons, majority within the academic community, some are supported by stronger reasons, and so on. And the choice in the end falls on non-experts, because in the end it is non-experts, those who select which policies from among this eligible set they are going to choose. So what do you think? Can this process be made more epistemically? Can we increase the epistemic quality of this process, or is this the best we can do, considering the conditions of reasonable pluralism and requirements of legitimacy? So that's for Professor Baccarini, and the second one for Aleksandra Knežević. And it's more like a comment than a question. And basically, because I'm not sure how it works in Serbia, but when we have this division of epistemic and political labor, we typically have interdisciplinary boards that are composed both of scientists or experts and of political figures, people nominated by the Ministry of Health or Ministry of Economics, and so on and so on. And it seems to me that your claim would be that this is not good enough, because those officials appointed by the government are not representative enough. And is this the reason why you're opting for mini publics and other more representative forms of citizen representation? Because those nominated by the government represent just the majority of the majority, or just what the government thinks and not what the people think. So it would be more like a clarificatory question. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Ivan. That's really interesting and helpful for me. So I don't think that rendering more epistemic the proposal would be helpful, because the situation I'm speaking about is a situation where there is still not clear agreement in the scientific community. So even if it appears at a particular moment that one thesis could be better than the other, the scientific community still is there with open eyes and open ears for new evidence to see what's going to happen. And in fact, there are not defeated positions. And this is the situation of pluralism among scientists that I have in mind. And in such situation, I think that democratic deliberation is the good solution. The democratic deliberation does not necessarily mean deliberation among citizens. So one possibility is that scientists deliberate among themselves. And then as a scientific community says, this is what we have to offer to society. The other possibility, however, that I leave open is that in the parliament, for example, or in the government, people deliberate by saying, okay, this is what science offers us, and let's deliberate on the basis of what they offer us. We can choose among different scientific theses that are in competition, and I'm thinking that this possibility of choosing is good, also because the values or the principles endorsed by citizens influence the epistemic choices. So, for example, like Jason Brennan and other people wrote, Winsberg and further out author and photo 3, I don't remember. When there are high values at stake, then also the epistemic criteria are very strong. This shows that depending of what matters to us, we can also vary our epistemic choices. So the question we are discussing now is not exactly the topic of Winsberg and others topic debate, but I think that we have some analogy to see that the values endorsed by people could influence also epistemic choices. And this is the reason why I think that it is reasonable to allow citizens to choose among scientific proposals in reasonable pluralism. That is, there could be something better or not, but nonetheless, the game is still open because this model permits a good equilibrium between respect of epistemic reasonableness and political and moral reasonableness.
Ivana, thank you for your question. So, yes, I was discussing about the Serbian crisis staff, which was which included only medical experts. So only medical experts were part of that crisis staff, which is also, for example, social scientists, psychologists. They were not present in the crisis staff, and therefore they were not part of those who advise policymaking and craft legislation. So that is the first problem. And the second problem is that, yes, that we need we need citizens in policy making, because we have to represent all needs. So our policies have to address all needs and priorities that people have. So, and my proposal is, if I can add slightly different from what Professor Baccarini suggests, is that I'm not sure that we should give people the option to choose between scientific theories. Because first, there is one assumption that where people discuss scientific issues, they do not rely on their arguments and reasons, but they rely on social cues. For example, who is discussing science? Who is presenting scientific facts? So they look at the source, and that's how they reach their decisions about science and about policy. So in that sense, instead of providing all the theories that met certain threshold according to the amount of the available evidence, my proposal is that scientists should look at what citizens need, and then in accordance to those values, they should decide which scientific theories are the best ones according to which we should craft policies. So this is my proposal. And that's why we need deliberation, because how can scientists find out what are the citizens' needs? Only if they deliberate with them. And also another beneficial thing of this deliberation is that citizens can also learn about science, and they can also have a clearer way of addressing particular issues which are highly influenced by their values. So my suggestion in that sense would be a bit different from what Professor has been suggesting.
Great, thank you. Snežana.
Thank you, Marko. Thank to all speakers. I have two questions, one for Hana and one for Elvio. Hana, actually, it's very interesting for me to see how you applied, the Wolf's idea about the engaged political philosophy to epistemology. And actually, my first question for you is that we see that you think that there is a kind of continuous tendencies in epistemology, or at least at some branch of epistemology in which we can see that we can go from the standard analytical epistemology to applied epistemology, and now, you know, we are somewhere near possibility to have a kind of engaged epistemology. So my first question is actually, do you think that we can really, there is a kind of real tendency, and actually Jonathan articulate also these kind of tendencies that have already existed in the epistemology. You know, we are going toward more and more engaged epistemology. And my second actually question for you is, you suppose that actually the real engaged epistemology will be that give a kind of concrete suggestion, advices concerning the public policy, concerning the institutions. Namely, you criticize the political epistemology or social epistemology, that they are too abstract, you know, suggesting to people that to be more virtuous, even freaker, you know. So I'm just wondering, do you think that engaged, the special element of engaged epistemology is to improve the public policies, namely social institutions, and not the individuals? Because we use to that, for instance, political philosophy and epistemology give the advices to individuals how to improve themselves. You know, so whether this engaged element is really engaged in sense that improve public policies, not, you know, it's not focus or target to epistemic agents. So this is for you. And the second for Elvio, just, you know, I'm wondering, you know, for some situation, what do you say? You know, in your amendment to Rawlsian, Elvio, to Rawlsian proposal, or your more engaged form of Rawlsian suggestion is as you explained to us, but I'm just wondering about one specific or concrete situation. Probably we have the controversy in the society between the experts and the non-experts, you know. So we can imagine that we have on the one side, you mentioned the controversy concerning the public health on the one side, and on the other side, I don't know, freedom of speech, democratic procedures, or something like that. So let us imagine a situation in which we have the experts which are, let us say, on one side, and the non-experts or the people who are not scientists on the other side. Do your proposal or your improvement or your amendment allow us a kind of epistemic paternalism in that cases, you know, that is actually probably non-democratic, or have some anti-democratic elements in which actually we can impose, we do not have, or we do not need to listen what the non-experts or non-scientists said to us.
Okay, thank you, Snežana. So for the first question, I do think that Wolf in 2019, which is when he published the article we're all here for, articulated a tendency that has existed in epistemology since the early 2010s, because, for example, Jason Brennan articulated his first criticisms of democracy in 2012 in a way that was clearly engaged. And after 2016, we saw many manifestations of epistemologies that, for example, satisfied Wolff's criterion for an engaged philosophy. Second, I am somewhat of a democratic pessimist and a pessimist regarding human nature. So I do think it is easier to correct institutions or to instill social policies than to teach people to behave virtuously. And this is purely because psychological research implies that it is very difficult for people to overcome their prejudice. it's very difficult for us to overcome our implicit biases and to change the heuristics we use when making decisions. So I think it's easier to structure the way humans naturally behave than to change their behavior, because that is simply more implausible than changing the institutions. So I hope that's a decent answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Snežana. As always, a pleasure to discuss with you. And regarding to the question whether I see a space for epistemic paternalism, so I don't know whether what I'm ready to allow is, and not only ready to allow, but is an essential part of the proposal, and I think of 4 Rosian proposals. So I don't know whether this is a kind of epistemic paternalism, but certainly what is allowed as an important part of the model of justification is a test of reasonableness. So unreasonable beliefs do not play any role in public justification. So what is certainly excluded is pseudoscience, fake news, or even things better than pseudoscience and fake news, but still characterized by clear epistemic flaws, insufficient evidence, while there is available better evidence, and so on. And in this sense, the democracy that I sustain is a kind of qualified democracy filtered through reasonableness. So in a paper I submitted and published a few years ago, the criticism, it was put as a criticism by one of the reviewers, is that the public reason model admits paternalism. So it could be that it admits paternalism. I could speak rather about the test of reasonableness, perhaps because I didn't study sufficiently the possible conceptualization of paternalism. But this is what I'm able to say you at the moment, that if you're worried about the possibility of entering all these epistemic flaws in the debate, I oppose this. So the reasons that enter legitimately in the arena are reasons filtered through reasonableness, and democratic deliberation concerns only eligible decisions that are in the space covered by reasonable reasons. But I would like to ask Marko, if there is some time, I would like to offer a comment to something Aleksandra said earlier in the comparison between her proposal and my proposal. So,
yes, of course, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. So to specify, I'm not definitely sustaining a position where I say that scientists offer scientific reasons, and when there is some reasonable pluralism among them, the final decision must be made by citizens. Not alone, I'm saying that the citizens decide about what are legitimate scientific reasons at the first step. So at the first step, the filter is only made by scientists. Only when there is reasonable pluralism, there is space for democratic deliberation. While still, I'm not saying that the democratic deliberation must be really democratic in the sense that it includes all citizens or their representatives. It can be democratic deliberation among scientists. But I think that the disagreement is not that I prefer democratic deliberation to, let's say, deliberation exclusively among scientists. The disagreement between your proposal and my proposal, if I understand you correctly, is that I admit the possibility that in the final step, the deliberation is among citizens, choosing, however, between the proposals declared as eligible by scientists. What is the best model in practice, I think, must be contextually determined among else. So is part, I think, of the duty of empirical sciences to establish whether citizens are better in selecting among eligible scientific proposals, or scientists are better in determining in the deliberation with citizens what are the values and the aims of citizens. I think that we cannot assume just and take it for granted that scientists are better in interpreting what are our aims and values than we are in interpreting what are the best scientific proposals among the eligible proposals offered by scientists. And a space, I think, for our choice must be left, because choice of scientific theses are determined by our values, in the sense, for example, that the stronger is our values that are implied, then legitimately we put a stronger burden of evidence on science. So, for example, we have two scientific proposals for measures in the pandemic, one more and the other less restrictive of liberties. One, I think, legitimate reason to prefer one proposal is to say, okay, this is less restrictive to liberty. They have more or less the same, there is more or less the same strength of empirical evidence on both sides. But one proposal is more restrictive, the other one is less restrictive to liberty. Because liberty matters very much to us, we can say that one has less burdens of proof, while the other stronger burdens of proof. And for this reason, we can democratically deliberate that the less restrictive is better. On the other hand, however, one can be more protective of health than the other, and then the situation is more complicated. But in any event, I think that we must allow values also to determine the epistemic criteria.
Thank you, Aleksandra. Do you want to comment on something that Elvio said before I give the word to Hana?
Yes, thank you. I would just like to say that with the last example which you gave regarding how different scientific advice can have unequal support depending on which values society appropriate is exactly what I was also arguing for. So if we have two different scientific theories which are equally justified, we will choose between them according to our values. So that was also my point exactly, that we should listen to people, what are their priorities, and according to that, decide which scientific theories we should put in policy making. So thank you very much for this clarification.
Okay, and Hana Baccarini.
Thank you.
I have problems with mixing our sounds sometimes.
It's all right. Hello, everyone. I'm just mindful of the fact that we have about 3 minutes left, so I'm not sure whether I should just sort of save this question for...
Oh, please go ahead. I mean, it won't be a problem if we prolong it for a couple of minutes. So
okay, so I'm going to try to make it as brief as possible. I'm really enjoying this. My question, I guess, goes mostly towards Elvio and Aleksandra, and again, I'm not really sure we'll have time to engage in it. And it comes from, obviously, you know, sort of full approval of the desire to make or to move beyond ideal theories in ways that incorporate a more descriptive or sort of reality recognizing kind of theorizing. But one of the things, but it also comes from a worry that we might then just replace ideal theory with ideal descriptions. And that's not what I would like to see happen, especially as someone who has done extensive empirical work on decision-making, including in the pandemic. One thing that always kept coming back to my mind when discussions about modes of scientific evidence and advice when it came to policy decisions related to this, or for that matter, anything else, came up, was the question of time. And deliberative models tend to assume that time is almost indefinite, so that time to decision making is almost unlimited, or at least is certainly more stretched than has been the case in a number of relevant examples that we've seen over the past decade or so, climate change and the COVID pandemic being the two most obvious ones. So in that sense, my worry is, well, okay, we can actually, we can devise different models in which we can, or we can from a philosophy of science perspective, devise different models that might work better, but they do not only usually fail to recognize differences in capability of citizens to access these kinds of deliberations. I think Joe Wolf has already referred to in terms of not everyone, you know, you would need to have some sort of idea of what equal or equitable representation of different voices in deliberative panels would mean. But it also relies on an implicit assumption, I think, and I mean, I've engaged with this in a number of papers, of motive. So why would citizens actually want to bother with this? I think one of the things that we're seeing in particular is the fact that under current conditions or under conditions of uncertainty, one of the differences in the capability to even assess, let alone assess and then translate into action any kind of knowledge or scientific evidence, has to do with time poverty. And obviously, the more marginalized, the more excluded, the more oppressed or deprived people are, the less time they have and the less control over their time we have. So I think that as long as we focus on the access end of the spectrum, so as long we can design as many and as perfect social institutions as we wish, but the, so to speak, the demand is not really going to be there. Rather, those institutions will be designed in ways that are predicated on the existence of an epistemic exemplar that does not really correspond to inequality or social inequalities in general. And I think the other problem with the kind of the institutional design side, which I certainly think is preferable than individual epistemic virtue side, but that doesn't mean that it's a solution, it's just a step towards a solution, is that in that sense, we also don't have enough time to assess what epistemic needs are. And that's the most tricky bit, because even this is, in a manner of speaking, an assumption. So we know that time poverty is an issue, and we know that time poverty corresponds with other kinds of poverty. So we can reasonably infer that some people will have less time and thus also less capability or less capacity to engage in lay assessments of scientific testimony. But we actually, especially under sort of conditions of uncertainty, we don't have time to figure out whether this would actually be the case. So again, I mean, you're more than welcome. I know this is a rather complex question, so you're more than, and it was, I guess, more of a comment than a question. You're more than welcome to engage with it or not, but it just occurred to me as something that kind of needs to be put on the table.
Thank you, Jana. Yeah, I think you raise a good point. What about time? That you really explained what a crucial point. So, if Elvio, do you want to?
Yes.
Go
so
ahead.
thank you very much for the question and also the possibility to offer some comments, even though we are out of time. So I will be the briefest possible. And I would say that I have in mind also time limits, so various real life conditions. And this is the reason, one of the reasons why I do not opt for a definite answer to the question of who has to deliberate and who has the authority for the final decisions. So some decisions must be very quick, because we do not have a lot of time. So in such cases, the authority to make decisions could be attributed to smaller amount of people in a smaller and more efficient and quick body. In other times, we have some more time to deliberate. And in such case, the deliberation could be more democratic. So in this sense, I have in mind the fact that time is not unlimited, that pressures of time can vary. And this is one of the reasons why I leave open the level of decision-making that is optimal for making decisions on these matters.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. This is also the matter which I was thinking about. So I would like to try to answer this question in this way. So imagine if before the pandemic, we were deliberating in policymaking. So our policymaking was structured according to the deliberative division of labor model. So scientists were already engaged in social issues, and they are already familiar with how citizens think about not science, but about their social needs, for example, and what they value and so on. So if before the pandemic, we already had the deliberative model, then during the pandemic, when scientists have to reach a quick decision, they would already be familiar with how exactly citizens think about certain issues. So my answer would be that the time of the pandemic is definitely not the case when we should start to deliberate, but maybe we should start to deliberate for probably the next thing which will happen, and we will urgently need a decision, which will then include the representation, the more, let's say, the representation of citizens, of scientists, and less of the inclusion of citizens in those decisions.
Thank you. If there are no more questions or comments, I mean, I'm willing to unless everyone is super hungry and wants to go for a lunch break. Everyone is, okay. So, okay, we'll stop here. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Hana, Elvio, Aleksandra for presenting, and thanks everyone for raising questions and comments. I think this was a very nice discussion. So now we'll take a lunch break and continue at 1:30 with another session with Christoph Royer, Jana Baccarini, and Igor Cvejić, Marijan Ivković, and Srđan Pradanović have a joint paper, so one of them will present it. Yeah, so we'll end here and see each other in a bit less than an hour. Thank you, everyone.